So the synopsis of articles appraised, including measurements, samples, and results, and what are the strengths and limitations of each article. So for the first article, caffeine intake from coffee or tea and cognitive disorders, a meta-analysis of observational studies. So essentially, giving you a brief overview of this study, was the researchers used observational epidemiological studies such as cross-sectional case control and cohort studies, and they looked at how they have reported inconsistent findings regarding the association between caffeine intake, coffee and tea, and the risk of cognitive disorders, such as dementia and Alzheimer's disease, cognitive impairment, cognitive decline. And what they essentially did was try to combine all of these studies. And some of the methods that they used to find these studies in the first place were PubMed and Embase. Three evaluators independently extracted and reviewed articles based on their predetermined selection criteria. Out of their results, out of 293 articles identified, 20 were epidemiological studies, which involved over 31,479 participants. And the pooled odds ratios, or relative risk of the caffeine intake from coffee or tea, was 0.82 with a 95% confidence interval. So some of the strengths and sample characteristics was the article's ability to assess for methodological quality. So essentially what they did was, with each article that they appraised, they assigned, based on a set of criteria, they awarded articles so many stars, with 8 being perfect. And overall, out of all the studies that they examined, the average star that was awarded was 6.8. So the precision or the methodological quality of each article was high. Also, in terms of the sample characteristics, with 31,479 participants, is really good. Having a large sample size will help make the results more precise as well. And the inclusion of multiple studies could be seen as a strength as well. The researchers went out of their way to find different types of models, different types of evidence to help support their claims. So some of the limitations with this article was that they only considered coffee and tea as a source of caffeine intake. Therefore, there was a limitation regarding the generalization of the findings regarding the effect of caffeine intake on the risk of cognitive disorders such as AD and dementia. Second, it was really hard to evaluate the exact amounts of caffeine intake for each study because multiple people drink or the amount of caffeine contained in a cup of coffee ranges, and the way coffee is prepared is different as well. So the results for this meta-analysis found that caffeine intake from coffee or tea was not associated with the risk of cognitive disorders. And this is an important distinction because, especially for a PICO question, is because essentially one is unlikely to develop a cognitive disease from caffeine. Thus, we know that we must be able to rule out that dementia and Alzheimer's disease are not being caused by caffeine. And that's an important distinction to make moving forward, especially if we want to look at whether or not caffeine is actually reducing the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So moving on to the next article, this is Coffee Consumption and Risk of Dementia and Alzheimer's Disease, a dose-response meta-analysis of prospective studies. So essentially, the researchers performed a dose-response meta-analysis to summarize the prospective data on coffee consumption and associated risk of dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And some of the methods that they used to identify these articles were by searching databases such as PubMed, and they did this all the way back from January 1966, and Web of Science from 1945 all the way up to October 4th, 2018. And they also scrutinized the reference list of the pertinent publications. In order to do this, 2 researchers independently reviewed the literature, and the results were combined using a restricted cubic-spline random effects dose-response meta-analysis based on a one-stage approach. And 8 relevant prospective studies were identified out of this search. In terms of the sample size, These studies included 7,486 dementia cases diagnosed among 328,000 individuals during an average follow-up of 4.9 to 25 years. And a meta-analysis of all 8 studies indicated no statistically significant association between coffee consumption and the risk of dementia. And the relative risk of dementia per 1 cup per day increment of coffee consumption was 1.09 with a 95% confidence interval, and the p equaling 0.37. The meta-analysis of 5 studies that focus on Alzheimer's disease also revealed no association between coffee consumption and Alzheimer's disease, and no deviations on the linear trend with a p of 0.79. So essentially, these results found do not support an association between coffee consumption and an increased risk of overall dementia or Alzheimer's disease specifically. But really interestingly, one of the studies that this article analyzed was one that found that showed daily versus no daily coffee consumption was associated with a reduction of 31% in the risk of Alzheimer's disease. Now, this is important because while this is similar to the previous article above, this one started to begin finding that there might be some association with a reduction of cognitive disorders in like those of Alzheimer's disease. Now, in terms of the strengths of this article, a strength of this meta-analysis was based on the fact that it utilized articles starting back from the early 1945s all the way up to 2018. And it made sure to utilize inclusion and exclusion criteria as well. And when reviewing those 8 prospective studies, the utilization and adjusting for confounding variables such as age, sex, gender, and ethnicity were key components of these research articles. Now, some of the limitations obviously goes back to only 8 studies being identified. Just looking at that number from between 1945 until now, only having 8 studies on this topic is, you would expect to see more. Another limitation of this meta-analysis was that some of the articles that out of the 8 prospective studies, some used self-reported coffee consumption, and based on our research, self-reported coffee consumption leads to measurement errors, which may have resulted in attenuated results. The exact amount and concentration of the coffee consumed are difficult to measure by a questionnaire, and therefore this particular meta-analysis may not have captured the true dose-response relationship between coffee consumption and dementia risk. Likewise, the diagnosis of dementia and AD also differed among the studies, and there might be some degree of misclassification of dementia. Thus, going based off that, it is interesting to note what I stated earlier, that some of the studies found that there was a reduction in Alzheimer's disease, which makes this research article very applicable to our PICO question. And now Dre is going to do the next 2 articles for you.